This is an audio sample of Trapped on Kooky Island by Teri Bethel. Review. Teri, your books have given our students rich, indigenous material which has certainly whet their appetites for voracious reading, and has also inspired them to explore and learn more about their culture. Grade 6 will be visiting Clifton Heritage Site, inspired by their reading of Trapped on Kooky Island. As an educator, I have confidence in the quality of your literature for our young minds. Not only is the plot content full of important life lessons, but the vocabulary and imagery widens students' knowledge and thinking skills. Mrs. Gillian Thompson, Principal, Trinity Christian Schools. Prologue. Long before the privateers and pirates sailed the pristine blue sea surrounding the Bahamas Islands, there were people, a peaceful lot of brown-skinned people called the Lucayans, whose sole purpose was to find a place of rest to call their own. Native Lucayans. Years after crossing the Bering Strait from East Russia, descendants of early settlers eventually migrated southward from Alaska through South America and up the Caribbean chain of islands. Some of those who made it to the northern Caribbean later sought refuge on the scattered group of islands, north of the Caribbean region. History remembers these islands as the Islas de los Lucayos, the Lucayans Islands. We know them as the islands of the Bahamas. In 1492, the Italian navigator, Christopher Columbus, in search of gold, silk, and spices made landfall in the Bahamas on an island he renamed San Salvador. After spending 2 weeks in the Bahamas, Columbus set sail for Cuba and Hispaniola, the island of today's Dominican Republic, where he found gold. By 1530, the peaceful Lucayans were taken away from the Bahamas Islands to work as slaves by Spanish authorities. They were made to work in the gold mines of Hispaniola, where they became extinct. Today, the natives of this chain of islands, like the rocks and keys, whisper many secrets. Secrets of hidden treasures even more valuable than the gold Columbus sought in 1492. Secrets entombed in a tongue that swells with anticipation, bursting to share its wealth with those who dared to see beyond that natural beauty into a place of destiny. Way back in time, when the earth was formed, heaven blew a kiss that landed upon these tropical isles. A kiss that cleared the waters of the Bahamas, making them the most beautiful, translucent colors of blue the human eye has ever seen. A kiss that sculpted underground channels, populated the oceans with a bounty of natural resources, and a kiss that prepared the land to receive its new inhabitants, the modern-day Bahamians. But if that wasn't enough, these peaceful islands have a story to tell that is now being revealed. Tye Johnson and his parents will flit through the isles to enjoy the unspoiled beauty of the islands, but can they handle the force that is seeking to disrupt the peaceful existence of all Bahamians? Chapter 1: An Evil Scheme. Hurry up, boys. Offload the boat quickly, it will soon be daybreak. The brown-skinned, bearded man with the raspy voice hastened his men to place his new shipment of weapons in an underground cavern. His hiding spot, a little key north of Little San Salvador in the Bahamas, known to the natives as Kooky Island. For the past several years, Richard Sands had eluded the authorities with the help of his influential friends. It cost him a pretty penny, but he knew that 2 of his former high school classmates owed him their lives. He would make them pay for it for as long as he could. Jax Miller and Theo Raming, now lawyers, were his 2 best assets. The higher they climbed in their career, the more he threatened to expose their unlawful dealings that almost cost them their lives, that is, if they did not do as he asked. Despite his rough behavior, Richard had a love for the finer things of life as well as an appreciation for history. Comfort was key, and beauty had to surround him even on a seemingly desolate island. His latest idea to take over the key was hatched by his interest in the natural underground beauty of the caves. As a child, Richard's father, Bugsy Sands, took him on diving trips in the Abaco Islands and the nation's deepest blue hole in Long Island. It was Bugsy's way of getting away from the self-inflicted pressures above the ground. Life was always about him and his dad. Richard never knew who his mother was, but was told later in life that she was a young schoolgirl Bugsy had picked up. No one saw the girl after Richard was born. It was a visitor who had moved to Abaco because of his love of cave diving that took them on their first cave diving encounter. Below the surface, beyond the natural depths of man, was a world unknown to most Bahamians. It was a world that had the appearance of a submerged planet sprinkled with ancient fossils of crocodiles and other animal formations which no longer live in the islands. The crocodiles or serpent-like creatures, as described by explorer Christopher Columbus, had white flesh that tasted like chicken when cooked and was eaten by the native Lukaians. Richard was happy not to have met any on his dives. On the outside of the underwater cave, the area looked like the usual island pond. The color was dark and uninviting, a typical watering hole that was surrounded by a mishmash of native shrubbery. Below the native forest was a virtual fantasy world of underwater gems. Around 150 feet below sea level, lay ancient formations that remained untouched for centuries beneath the island's surface. To access the cave, Richard and his guide had to dive deep and long, penetrating a layer of harmful gases that could prove fatal if they lingered in it too long. He stayed close to his guide. Piercing through it, however, made you go weak at the overwhelming beauty not ever seen in even the richest palaces. Richard saw a natural wealth that was more beautiful than the most priceless diamonds in the world. These gems, however, would not survive above ground. To enjoy them, you would have to be a good swimmer and learn how to swim with a side-mounted oxygen tank and never alone. Richard couldn't imagine why until he found himself having to sliver through narrow passages of flower-shaped crystals that looked as though they were lightly dusted with sparkling shades of pink. The underwater caves, which could extend for miles running somewhat parallel to the surface above, were just like above-ground caves with their elaborate passages. He was terrified at first swimming with a side-mounted oxygen tank through the deep, narrow tunnels with stalactites and stalagmites that looked like elaborately sculpted icicles sometimes coming within inches of his face. It was pitch black under the water, so any lighting needed had to be carried or worn. Richard could see why the Abaco blue holes were his father's favorite places to relax. As long as he had oxygen and free time on his hands, it was Bugs' sanctuary. Bugsy needed it. Above ground, he was a hustler who always had some scrapings with the law. The time spent together bonded the father and son duo, but instead of teaching young Richard positive life principles, his father taught him how to get rich quick by taking advantage of others. Rich or poor, it didn't matter. Those who knew the pair knew that someday they would pay the price for their wicked dealings. Richard, who later called himself Santos, had taken his father's schemes up another level. Life was a game of chance to him, the more risk, the more pleasure, the more satisfaction, at the expense of others. Deep inside, Richard was still a spoilt little boy playing games, a boy in a man's body who never learned how to care for others. It was take and take again, anything to satisfy his thirst for wealth and power. It was quite by chance Richard found an unexplored cave on the uninhabited Kooky Island. He knew it was safe for him to set up as locals were not inclined to go beyond the first 8 feet of a dark cave for any reason. Richard found that the cave had many passages and one that led to an opening that appeared to be magnificently formed to accommodate a small fleet of submarines. Some of the areas of the cave reminded him of Hamilton's cave on Long Island. The ceilings were so tall in areas that it looked like a grand room with hand-sculpted artifacts softly brushed with amazing shades of green, tan, and coral colors. Rumor had it that Italian submarines and German U-boats traveled through the islands during World War II. While some claimed that the U-boats hid in the remote islands, there was no evidence that they were on Kooky Island. Another area of the cave looked as though it was a storage area for Lukaians artifacts. There were 2 dugout canoes which looked exactly like what he saw in his schoolbook as a kid. He also saw what appeared to be the remains of 3 wooden oars and a duho-like stool. When lanterns were lit, you could see light etchings on the cave walls which were chipped away by one of Richard's men, much to his annoyance. Richard didn't think about donating the findings to the Bahamas Historical Society for all Bahamians to enjoy. That would have been too noble a thing to do. He knew the remaining artifacts could fetch a pretty penny with international collectors in the black market, so he stored them until he could contact a buyer. What he soon realized was he needed manpower to get his work done. His main reasoning was to safeguard himself from being caught red-handed in criminal activities. Although he was still in good shape at 43 years of age, he decided to hire what he called his disposables to do the dirty work. Sands recruited young men who couldn't think for themselves but were content to follow the crowd and could be bought with a few measly dollars. Recruiting people to work for him was easy. First, he sought after young men who had no families or commitments, people who he could easily uproot from their community and not be missed if he had to erase their existence from the planet. Richard sought minds that could easily be influenced by giving young people a sense of power, especially those who were from broken families or known troublemakers still in high school. Since they didn't listen to their parents or teachers, he figured they didn't have much of a future. It was even more exciting for Richard to separate young men from families who really cared for them. He enjoyed causing rifts between them and destroying any connection the boys had with their fathers. Richard prided himself on this tactic he took from the animal kingdom. To kill their victim, the hunting animals would first isolate and then converge on the helpless prey. So, he got them to believe that their families did not want them or cared about them anymore. This made them accept Richard and his gang as their new family. Richard Sands wanted a crew who were dispensable, who had no vision and could be paid off with a pair of new tennis shoes or a watch. This was his initial workforce. By day, Richard schemed and slept. By night, he and his men wreaked havoc while unsuspecting people slept in the comfort of their homes. Chapter 2: The Fight. Slap him, Tye, slap him, was all 13-year-old Tye Johnson heard as his classmates chanted around him urging him to hit the older boy who was egging him on for a fight. It was a hot, dusty day in the schoolyard, and Tye was already irritated with Kyle. Not so much for how he was treated, but because he chose to bully kids younger or smaller than himself. Kyle reached out and grabbed Tye by the neck, goading him to punch him. His sweaty neck slipping free with one swift move his dad, Captain Tye Johnson, had taught him. The Johnson brothers, Tye and Alex, knew self-defense. They were taught, however, to use it only when necessary. Tye knew this was not one of those necessary situations. He could just walk away. The problem was he didn't want to. His pride was affected. How would he look to his peers? The kids continued to chant as they encircled the pair. Kyle came 2 inches from Tye's face, daring him to throw a punch. Tye wasn't thinking about the consequences of his actions at the moment. There was nothing he wanted more than to feel the palm of his hand reeling full force against his tormentor's face. It was the last day of school before the start of their midterm break, and he had put up with Kyle's bullying for far too long. You have just listened to an audio sample of Trapped on Kooky Island. Copies of this book are available in Nassau, Bahamas at Logos Bookstore, in Eleuthera at Office General, the North Eleuthera Craft and Snack Place opposite the airport, and on Amazon.com. Get your copy today.